At the tail end of the 19th century, the United States was in something of a rough patch. For much of its history, the Navy had gone through periods of expansion and periods of contraction, periods of Congress funding it, and then taking that funding away. The 1880s were one of the worst periods for the Navy in this regard. Most of the ships it possessed were either antique sailing frigates, or, at the most modern, Civil War holdovers. And most of those were of questionable material condition. A handful of more modern cruisers and such did exist, but nothing like what European navies had. And even those modern ships weren't exactly the greatest designs in the world. Enter ships like USS New York, one of the very first armored cruisers of her kind in the world. A contemporary of the more famous Olympia, and in fact entering proper service 2 years earlier, New York was an interesting case. Interesting in that she was a remarkably forward-looking ship for the US Navy at the time. You look at a blueprint of her, like I have on screen right now, and she looks exactly like you'd expect of a generic armored cruiser. An early one, admittedly, but still recognizable. She entered service before many other ships of her more modern styling, including the French one, more generally looked at as the first modern armored cruiser. For all of that, though, she's something of a forgotten ship. The same can generally be applied to all American armored cruisers, to be fair, yet the point remains. So how about we change that a bit? Now, her life began in the late 1880s, as I alluded to earlier. In common with ships such as Olympia, New York was drawn up as the USN was moving away from where it had been, which was an ill-funded and under-maintained mess ostensibly intended for coast defense and convoy raiding. Instead, you see the first shifting towards a proper ocean-going force. Actual battleships. Proper ocean-going cruisers, albeit only a handful that would actually end up being built. New York would, as mentioned, prove to be forward-thinking for the time in this regard. The genesis of her design comes down to two things. The USN having a worry about new quick-firing guns, and a desire for any armored cruiser to be capable of operating with the battle fleet. Sound familiar? Both of these were complementary requirements, insofar as both pushed for a relatively heavily armored cruiser. In keeping with the desire for commerce raiding, though, the ship had to be as fast as possible as well. So the armor couldn't be battleship thickness, even if there were early concepts for a small battleship at the same time. So, with this in mind, we jump from 1888, when the initial order was placed, to 1890, when the design was being finalized. The small battleship had been ditched, and we, instead, focus on a large cruiser. In the interests of defeating enemy cruisers, she had to be heavily armed. To avoid being heavily damaged by quick-firing guns, she also had to be armored enough to protect the important bits. The result is the prototypical armored cruiser. Heavy armament, if not battleship caliber, and a belt of armor protecting the machinery and the like. USS New York came out of this design process as a ship of 8,150 tons, though her full load was just shy of 9,000 tons. Quite large for a cruiser at the time, though she was intended for long-distance sailing as well. You had a need for coal storage, which added quite a bit of weight. This displacement bought a ship equipped with 6 8-inch 203mm guns, 4 of which were mounted in your standard pre-dreadnought layout, 2 twin turrets on either end of the ship. The remaining 2 were mounted on the wing positions, on port and starboard respectively. Backing these up were 12 4-inch 102mm rapid-fire guns for her secondary battery. These were mounted in sponsons along the hull, and a further 8 57mm guns made up her tertiary battery, supported in turn by 4 37mm guns. And rounding it all out were the almost obligatory 3 hull-mounted 14-inch torpedo tubes. To put the armored and armored cruiser then, New York had a 4-inch thick main belt, 9 feet deep and extending 4 feet below the waterline. This belt admittedly only covered the machinery spaces, though this was a conscious choice on how to emphasize protection. This can be seen as well in her armored deck, which was 6 inches thick at its greatest, declining to 2.5 inches at the ends. That is remarkably thick for an armored deck at the time. As for her initial turrets, they carried 5.5 inches of armor with 10-inch thick barbette armor. All of this could cut through the water at about 20 to 21 knots on 8 boilers, driving 4 triple expansion engines to 16,000 horsepower. Her design speed was 20 knots, and she hit 21 on trials, so a happy medium of between 20 to 21 is her more standard top speed. While not the fastest cruiser around even at the time, her combination of speed, armor, and firepower was pretty impressive. And admittedly, she was also still pretty fast for the time. In all of this, New York was a massive step up from her immediate predecessors, both in the non-Olympia protected cruisers and in her more direct predecessor, USS Maine. While she is certainly not as heavily armed or armored as later armored cruisers, she is very much pointing the way forward in her layout and her general design goals. But with her design process and such done, it's history time again. I'm afraid this will be another case where there are a couple really interesting things, and then a lot of generic service. Laid down on September 30th, 1890, and launched on December 2nd, 1891, USS New York would actually be completed incredibly fast for an American cruiser of the time. Her commissioning on August 1st, 1893, puts her ahead of both the ill-fated Maine and USS Olympia, as mentioned earlier. Her initial service would prove to be a fairly quiet affair, though. First assigned to the South Atlantic Squadron, she would depart for Brazil in December of 1893, remaining in the area until March 23, 1894. At that point, she was transferred to the North Atlantic Squadron, spending most of her time in, well, the Caribbean, not the North Atlantic. Past that, and continuing her little musical chairs routine, New York would next be assigned to the European Squadron in 1895. She visited Germany as the United States representative to the opening of the Kiel Canal, before swapping squadrons again back to the North Atlantic one. Here she would remain operating around the eastern seaboard until 1898. If you know your American history, and your history of USS Maine, you know what's coming next. New York steamed to Cuba in April after the beginning of the Spanish-American War. She joined other American warships, initially anyway, in doing what the next New York would do some decades later, albeit to a different target. That is, bombarding the poor Cuban coast with prejudice. Specifically, Spanish fortifications in this case. Failing to track down the Spanish Navy, New York pulled back before being assigned as flagship of Admiral Sampson for the Santiago campaign. Alas, while she was present for that particular battle, she did little of note in it. Some of her engines were disconnected, lowering her speed. This was a feature of her design, intended to save fuel at cruising speed, which resulted in her missing the battle, in addition to the fact she was off station to take Admiral Sampson to a meeting. As a result, in spite of being the ostensible flagship, New York only fired a few passing shots at a torpedo boat towards the end. After this point, and after the end of the war, she returned to her old habit of ping-ponging across the globe. First assigned to Latin America, she carried out training cruises while showing the flag in various trouble spots. In this process, during 1899, she continued her trend of being ahead of the curve by being one of the first 3 USN ships to receive a wireless unit. That being said, her next tour of duty would take her further than ever before, as she sailed to the Philippines in 1901 to become the flagship of the new Asiatic Fleet. A detour to Japan for the unveiling of the Perry Expedition Monument in July 1901 would probably be her most exciting moment there. True enough, she spent some time supporting operations against Filipino rebels, but then that isn't exactly something an armored cruiser could do much for, other than shooting up the coast or interdicting supplies. The rest of the first couple years of the 20th century would see her sail around the Pacific, jumping from the Asiatic to Pacific Squadron in 1903. She became flagship of that squadron in 2004, before returning to Boston for modernization in January 1905. This modernization saw her weaponry completely torn out, with her main guns and turrets replaced by newer models. In this case, she went from 8 6-inch 35 caliber guns to 4 8-inch 45 caliber weapons. This increased her firepower in spite of losing 2 barrels due to the higher velocity of the new weapons. The turrets, meanwhile, had improved armor. The turret faces increased from 5 to 6 inches in thickness, while the barbettes decreased from 10 to 6 inches, but it was an improved armor type, so actual protection improved. As for the rest of her weaponry, she lost the wing-mounted 8-inch guns and her torpedo tubes entirely, while her secondary battery changed from 4-inch guns to newer and more powerful 5-inch 50 caliber guns. 10 of them, so while she lost 2 4-inch guns in the trade, the increased firepower makes up for the slightly fewer barrels. Her tertiary battery was swapped out for 8 3-inch guns. As for the rest of her refit, the final portion saw her 8 boilers replaced by 12 newer models, though this didn't really increase her speed so much as just maintain it. Coming out of this refit in 1910, following a short stint out of reserve in 1909, New York was a much more capable ship, showing her age in the era of dreadnoughts certainly, but still capable of at least second-line service. Such second-line service as the Asiatic Fleet, for example. It was while serving there she received her first name change, swapping to USS Saratoga in February 1911 to open up her name for the next USS New York, the sister ship of the more famous USS Texas. She would spend the vast majority of her career as Saratoga in the Far East. She only returned to the United States in 1916, entering into a well-earned reserve position, only for the United States to jump into the Great War, pulling Saratoga right back out of reserve. She remained on second-line duties, however, operating off the West Coast as part of Pacific Patrol Force 7. This service would see nothing much of note, other than capturing a merchant ship carrying 32 German agents and a handful of American draft dodgers. Interesting combination there, I suppose. It would be the only excitement she got under the name of Saratoga, though. In November of 1917, she sailed through the Panama Canal to join the cruiser force on the East Coast. She would then have her name changed for a second time, ending up with USS Rochester. This followed the trend of swapping the names of armored cruisers named for states to a city in that state, in this case Rochester, New York. Quite a few cruisers had to do this, as battleships took their existing name. In this case, of course, it was to open up Saratoga for a battlecruiser instead, but the general theme remains. Now sporting a new and final name, Rochester would mostly do convoy escort duties, with the odd training mission in the middle. Without seeing any combat, she would end out World War I by transporting soldiers home. And then, after the war, being assigned as flagship for the ships supporting the famous cross-Atlantic flight by the Curtiss NC seaplanes. However, by now really starting to show her age as a design of the late 19th century, Rochester only served as secondary roles for the remainder of her career. She largely stuck close to home, barring stints such as carrying General Pershing to Chile in 1925. It would, in fact, only be operations in Latin America that drew her away, and those were mostly supporting other ships and other forces. Such would be her 1920s until in 1931, by now 40 years old, she returned to her old haunt in the Far East. Rochester spent April 1932 to April 1933 in China, supporting the American presence there, before decommissioning in the Philippines at the end of April. There she would remain, only formally being taken off the Navy list on October 28, 1938. Still sitting pretty in Subic Bay, Rochester would be present, if by no means fit for service, when the Japanese invaded the island. By this point, having been stripped of some of her weapons during the Great War, and reduced to 4 boilers with 2 funnels in 1927, she was very far from her heyday, even assuming her equipment was at all functional after nearly a decade dockside. Regardless of her actual capacity to move or fight, Rochester was scuttled on December 24, 1941, to keep her out of Japanese hands. By this point in her 5th decade of existence, Rochester was old and tired. While not the best fate, that she lasted for just over 50 years is nothing to sneeze at. Indeed, following her sinking, she was turned into an artificial reef following demolition efforts in 1967. Those detonations, intended to clear space for deep draft tankers, did severe damage to her midsection, which had previously been largely intact, but the ship remains in decent enough shape considering her age. And a popular dive spot. That isn't the worst legacy for what one could, convincingly, argue as the first modern armored cruiser based on her design features and time of commissioning. Or, at very bare minimum, at least one of the first. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.